The invasive weed Tutsan was first found in New Zealand in the late 1800s and identified as a problem weed in the 1950s. Around 1980, a species-specific rust arrived in the country that was thought to have been windborne. It largely wiped out the plant for the next 20 years. But this unintended biocontrol of Tutsan was not to be a permanent fix. Hugh Gourlay of Landcare Research explains.
Around 2005, 2010, we started noticing that Tutsan had become quite a large problem in the central North Island and had started invading quite large tracts of agricultural land, but particularly along roadsides, edges of forests and those kind of things, and particularly disturbed land areas like forests where they'd been logging and things like that. So this farmer-based community group based in Taumarunui contacted me and said, hey, we've got this problem, can you help us out with this? So we then did some science around what was going on in New Zealand. It would appear that the North Island plants have either become resistant to the North Island rust, or the North Island rust is not being very effective against the plants anymore. In the South Island, the plant is still relatively rare and the rust still seems to be keeping it under control at the moment, but that may not be true in the long term. Having found that the rust that we had here weren't impacting on the plant, we then started trying to look and see, was there another rust in the original zone that Tutsan came from that might actually impact on our plants here, and particularly our North Island genotype. So we started doing some surveys both here in New Zealand and in Europe, looking for the plant, measuring its densities, comparing densities of the plant overseas and here in New Zealand, and looking for rusts, doing the DNA of the plants and the DNA of the rusts, and then seeing if we could find new rusts overseas that might infect our plants here. Now we found really only 4 different types of rust overseas, and we found 8 different types or genetic types of Tutsan. We also found several potential insects as biocontrol agents, but 2 in particular interested us, and they only occurred in Georgia, in European Georgia, as part of the Caucasus. I found some books way back from the 1600s suggested that Tutsan originated in the Caucasus and then moved through southern Europe into southern Spain, Portugal and into the UK, primarily as a medicinal plant. So it was important for us to actually go to the origin or the endemic range of Tutsan in the Caucasus to see what was attacking it there, see if there was a new rust, to see if there were some insects that were highly specific there that we could utilise as a biocontrol agent. So what we've got to at the end of a 10-year process is we now have 2 insects that have been approved for release by the Environmental Protection Authority. One is a leaf-feeding beetle and the other is a leaf-feeding and seed-feeding moth. Both originate in Georgia, both have been proven to be specific to Tutsan and only Tutsan, and we believe that both are likely to have a significant impact on the plant. Here we have this kind of classic growth form, nice green leaves. It has lovely yellow flowers which turn into red berries, and the red berries carry probably 1,000 seeds in each one of these. So hence why it's such a big problem, because you can see most of these shoot tips end up with flowers on them and several flowers on them that each form a berry. The plants in the field tend to not produce quite such large green fluffy sort of leaves, and they're a little more sturdy than this, but this is the type of plant that we get. This particular plant has some damage on it from our moth that we've introduced, and the moth attacks the shoot tips, and you can see in the later part of the season the moth caterpillars attack the shoot tips, and here's a classic example of a shoot tip that's been attacked by a caterpillar. The tip has died and the caterpillar is now living in the stem just down around about here. And on this plant there are a number of shoot tips have been attacked and are dying from the impact of the caterpillar. Now that's late in the season that the caterpillars do that kind of damage to the plant. But earlier in the season, around about Christmas time, the plant is normally covered in seed pods, and that's the food that the moth's caterpillars prefer, is the seeds in the seed pods. And so most of the seed pods, if not all of the seed pods, will have a caterpillar in there eating all of the seeds inside the seed pod. And the caterpillars are likely to actually consume more than one seed pod during its development time from egg to adult. The other insect that we looked at, which is the beetle, is a foliage feeder. it starts consuming the foliage. And when we've been into Georgia and its native range, I've seen plants where there is no foliage on the plants above ground. So all of this green material has been removed, and the only thing that's left are the stems. So we think the beetle's going to have quite an impact because it will simply remove all the photosynthetic material and stop the plant from growing. So between the two, we've got one that's going to eat the seeds primarily, but also attack new growth tips and foliage. And then the beetle and its juvenile stages are going to consume all of the green foliage. Normally, biocontrol projects take 10 and maybe 20 years to see a significant impact on plant populations. So we may be looking for that long. We made releases, the first releases of the moth this last summer in central North Island. We'll be looking the next 2 years to see if it's established and then see what the population numbers are like as time goes on. And we're hoping to releases of the beetle this coming summer, but it's likely to be a long time. If I can just have a little bit of a story about sort of biological control and that kind of time span, the beetle that we're looking at to bring in for Tutsan and make releases is closely related to the St John's wort beetle. Now that was brought into New Zealand in the 1940s and 1950s, and within 10 to 15 years had really removed St John's wort from the face of the New Zealand high country. 40% of New Zealand's high country was devastated by St John's wort until this beetle came in. And it did a huge job and a huge impact, saved the country billions since it's done that. So we expect that this beetle could do the same thing, but it's not going to happen in a short period of time.
This program was made with funding from New Zealand On Air.